Maria Francis, and I'm one of your teachers here at TAFE Digital. Thank you so much for agreeing to have this session recorded for other students who can't attend. Now, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that wherever we are meeting on Aboriginal land, and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging, and even more so being NAIDOC week. And Joseph, love your background, Hill Country. Thank you for that. Okay, welcome. We are going to be doing part 2 of Cluster 1 Skills Assessment. As most of you know, I do run these sessions on a weekly basis, and we have selected Cluster 1 Skills because it is a difficult assignment. And what we find is that once you pass Cluster 1, the good news is Cluster 2 gets easier. Okay, so hopefully this will be the last session for some of you, and you can then submit your assignment. Otherwise, for those that haven't completed the first half, please come back next Thursday at 11 o'clock. Now I'm going to share my screen and actually show you the question. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah? Okay, fantastic. Excellent. So like I said, we are going to go through part 2 skills assessment today. Okay, so this is the table that we need to actually unpack. Now, a lot of our students get confused with this table, but once we talk it through, you soon realise how easy it is, okay? Now, we've given you an example, children in the workplace, and we've actually unpacked this, identifying the legal and ethical responsibilities for this framework.
Can you zoom in a bit so we can see it a bit easier? Thank you.
I was just about to say that. I cannot read that.
Is that better? Yeah?
Yeah. A little bit more. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. And because it's red.
What might be helpful is, I don't know, you might want to have the assignment in front of you as well. So that's something else. You can have your assignment in front of you, and you can obviously see that because this is essentially the assignment. So we've given you a sample with regards to how we've unpacked the legal and ethical responsibilities for children in the workplace, for the organisation and for the individual. And then we've also spoken about the consequences here. Okay, so what this question is asking us to do is unpack two things. One is policy frameworks, as you can see there, and the other is continuing professional education. Now let's start with policy frameworks. Now, a lot of students get confused because of the word frameworks. So I want you to ignore the word framework and think about 3 relevant policies and procedures within an organisation, within community services. I want you to name 3 policies for me. People think, what are some relevant policies that you need to know and adhere to within community services?
WHS, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Joseph. WHS is one, yeah. Duty of care is another, yeah. Work health and safety. So I'm going to WHS, duty of care, code of ethics, amazing, okay. I'm going to put mandatory reporting, okay, because that's really important. And I'm going to put one more, privacy and confidentiality, okay. That's really important within community services. Okay, with these policies in mind, what do you think is the organisation's legal and ethical responsibility? Okay, this is the question. Legal and ethical responsibility, legal and ethical considerations when it comes to these policies. What do you think the organisation needs to do when it comes to ensuring that their staff know about these policies and their staff can adhere to these policies? What do you think is their responsibility?
Provide training.
Yeah, provide training, exactly. Provide training, okay? They might want to do audits to ensure that their staff, thank you, Marion, to ensure that their staff are upholding the policy, okay? So they need to have access to training, they need to have access to the policy. There's no point having a policy that's located on a hard drive or a shelf somewhere that nobody looks at, okay? So the organisation, they need to ensure that for new workers and existing workers that they understand all of the relevant policies and procedures that the organisation needs to advise to them in order for them to do their job, okay? Provide training, access to the policy, okay? They need to uphold the policy, so they might need to do an audit. Now, the legal responsibility, what's that? When it comes to the law, what do you think is the organisation's responsibility?
Making sure they're up to date.
Excellent. Thank you so much. It has to be up to date, okay? Because as we all know, legislation changes. I'll give you one example. Occupational health and safety. That's what it used to be called. We don't call it that anymore. We call it work health and safety. Yes? So legislation, policy, it changes regularly and we need to be up to date with it as an organisation, okay? We've got here safety, accountability, excellent. So all of this, the organisation needs to ensure that their staff know that in order for their staff to be safe and in order for their staff to have accountability with regards to what they're doing. So all of this is amazing. So you can include all of this in your answer. Accountability. All right. Expand on that answer there, okay? Obviously I'm writing in shorthand. Now with these ticker boxes, can everybody see that? I want to make it a little bit bigger. With these ticker boxes, I would suggest ticking everything except international, okay? Because it's quite rare that we would look at international legislation, but we certainly do look at national and obviously state legislation. So the child protection legislation, for example, is state-based. So if you live in New South Wales, you have legislation for New South Wales as opposed to those that live in Queensland and Victoria. Does that make sense? But international, it's quite rare that we would use that, so just leave that blank for now. Now I'm going to move on to the next thing we need to answer, and it's really simple, guys. What do you think is your legal and ethical responsibility as an employee when it comes to these policies and procedures?
It's up to us to make sure we know the things we're, and doing the things that we know. So it's individuals' responsibility to, make sure they're doing the stuff that they're meant to.
Excellent. Thank you, Joseph. And Kim's also put down, putting them into practice. Amazing. You don't need me. It is our responsibility to adhere, okay, and practice and follow any code, any policy, procedure as outlined by the organisation. That's your job as an employee, as an individual. Short and sharp. It's all you need to write. It's my job to adhere, to practice, to follow any code, procedures as outlined by the organisation because I'm an employee there. Does that make sense, team? Yeah? Okay. Now I'm going to move over to consequences. So just make sure you tick these two boxes because that's what we're unpacking. Don't ask me about the boxes. I don't know why they're there, but they are. So let's tick the boxes. Now, what do you think is the consequence for the organisation if they have staff that ignore work health and safety? If they have staff that are telling everybody about client information, okay, or they're not reporting child protection concerns? What have we got here? We've got Kim. Yeah, fines. That's right. That could be exposed to a fine. Yeah.
Distrust, so community distrust within the organisation.
Excellent.
We're seeing that a lot at the moment with the aged care facilities and COVID. I think there's a lot of distrust. So yeah, that's sort of happening.
Excellent. Community distrust will lead to loss of reputation. Okay, you might lose business. So loss of business and clients not attending. You could lose your license. Yeah, loss of license depending on how severe the breach is. And the consequence for the organisation is that you could have, an injured worker or injured clients. Yeah, worse off. Yeah. And what about the individual? They're going to get an award? They're going to get a middle of the year? What do you think is the consequence?
Fines, go,
loss of job.
A legal situation.
So I'm going to put written warning, fines, or loss of employment. But the reality is, in terms of procedural fairness, it really does depend on how severe the breach is. So disciplinary procedures will actually be set by the organisation depending on the breach. Do you think that's fair to say? Because I would hate to think that if I did a minor mistake that I would get fired right away. So I might get a written warning, or I might be put into further training. So I'm just going to put here.
Or demoted from your position.
Exactly right. So I'm just going to put disciplinary procedures will be outlined by the organisation. Can't spell today, team.
Is there certain breaches, like is there an amount of breaches that you can do that makes it impossible for you to get employment anywhere else? Like, can you get a mark against your name, or?
It depends what it is. It's not like we're doctors or nurses or clinical staff where we get deregistered, right? So I think the bottom line is, if you get fired from a community services organisation for, let's say, breaching confidentiality, I would think that you would be able to get another job in another organisation, but you might want, you may or may not use the previous job as a reference, but I would hope to think that people do learn from their mistakes, because you are working in an industry where we are helping vulnerable people. It's not about making money. So, but it really does depend on what the breach is.
Yeah, sorry, that came across wrong.
Oh, no, it didn't at all.
That came across right. I was like, that came across as if I was like, oh, how many breaches can I do before? Yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay, are people happy with that? So the totality of your two answers here should equate to about 150 to 250 words. Yeah, so just expand a little bit more. Obviously, I've written in shorthand, and then you should get your answers up to the word limit there. Clear as mud. Are we happy with that? Happy to move on? Yeah, I've got a few nods and a thumbs up from Kim. Thank you. Okay. So the next one that we're unpacking is continuing professional education. Now, what I want you to have a look here or consider are two things. One is obviously certain roles where clinically, that they need to be registered. Okay, so they need to be registered, whether or not you're a lawyer, you need to pass the bar, you need to be registered, whether or not you're a doctor or a nurse, versus a social worker or a community services worker, where legally we don't need to be registered, but ethically it is good practice for us to, be up to date with our learning around what the best practice is. Yes? Now, before we continue, Hayley, you have your hand up?
Oh, I ended up writing it. I just wanted to know, we're not supposed to do this as we go, are we? We're supposed to do this later in our own words?
What do you mean?
The assessment.
Yeah, you can jot down notes, as you can see on screen, and then obviously when you finish, you can then write it in sentences in your own words.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I've left it there for you to view, because this is obviously collectively we've come up with the answers together. So you can write it down, take a screenshot of it, whatever you feel like, and then obviously you can write it in your own words later. Yeah. Okay. So for the organisation, now same thing goes. I'm going to tick everything here except for international, and same for these boxes over here. So for the organisation, what do you think is their legal and ethical responsibility when it comes to ensuring that their staff continue professional education?
I think when a new starter begins, so they have a bit of a pack or a system for that new staff to learn about the policies and procedures, and they keep that up to date, so that if someone
Like an induction
joins, they're not getting the wrong information.
Yeah, excellent. So they need to ensure that their staff are adequately trained, correct? And the important thing about continuing professional education is that they need to keep training their staff. Their staff need to keep training up to date. Okay.
Like an ongoing WHS.
100%, exactly right. Like I'm a social worker, and I finished my social work degree 17 years ago. That doesn't mean that I don't do any further training to then be a social worker. By law, I don't need to be registered because I'm not a lawyer or a doctor, but ethically, I need to maintain currency around current learning, around what is the best practice there is when it comes to working with vulnerable children and families, or depending whatever your role is, you need to uphold your skills. Does that make sense? and it is the organisation's responsibility to ensure that I receive that training. Okay, so every year TAFE ensures that their TAFE teachers have mandatory training. Now, the mandatory training that we get is around child protection, is around code of conduct, is around respectful workplace, is around cyber and information security, it's around mandatory reporting and child protection. So there are certain things that organisations can actually put down to make sure that their staff need up-to-date training every single year. Does that make sense? And it needs to be ticked off against my name. Otherwise, I can't continue to teach. So that really is the organisation's responsibility, and they can provide study leave for staff. They can provide, you know, time off work, time off daily duties to do the training. Yeah, so that's the organisation's responsibility. Yeah, does that make sense? What has Hayley got here? I volunteer for the Salvos as a youth coordinator, and there are different things I need to do in my actual work for NDIS. Exactly, 100%. That is their legal and ethical responsibility to make sure that they have staff on board that can do the job. Okay, now all of us, are we going to say yes to a doctor that finished their, you know, doctor degree or whatever you want to call it 10 years ago to do surgery on you tomorrow? No. Not if they haven't done any training, any recent training, they're not going to do surgery on you. Does that make sense? You want to make sure that you have staff that can actually do the work. Now, what do you think is your responsibility as an individual?
To attend training days when they're offered.
100%. What else? If you don't know how to do something, what do you think is important?
To go to them, your manager or supervisor, and ask for further support. I'm just so you right now.
Hayley, I can hear you and I can actually see what you're saying. 100%. Ask for further support and training. Be honest about your competencies and experience. Okay? Nothing's going to happen if you say to your manager, I need further training. I've never done this before. Yeah? You have to. We all want to come to work to do a good thing. We don't wake up and go, I'm going to come into work and do a bad job today. We all want to uphold and do the right thing, particularly for us because we are working with vulnerable children and families and vulnerable families. Yes? So be honest about competency and experience. Ask for training. Attend the training. Yeah? That's my responsibility as an employee of the organisation, right? Because what are the consequences, team? If we don't do any of this, what do you think is the consequence for the organisation and for the individual?
It gives the
Well,
organisation.
the organisation could have workplace accidents and face legal.
Yeah. Legal issues, fines, loss of reputation once again. You could have injury to workers and clients.
But injury to the, oh yeah, sorry, you said the clients.
Yeah, okay.
The client to receive like the best support as well.
Yeah, exactly right. So you're not delivering best practice.
Yeah, exactly.
Service that they deserve. Okay, and for the individual worker, I would say, can you imagine coming into work every day not knowing what you're doing, or thinking, oh, I'm going to do this, but I might get a complaint because I don't know how to do it properly. Yeah, so there's no job satisfaction. Okay, does that make sense? There's no job satisfaction. You're exposed to complaints. Okay. And you can't deliver best practice because you don't know it. So that's not obviously a good feeling. You can't deliver best practice or do the best job that you can because you don't know how to. Are people okay with that? Do people get the gist of this question? Hands up, those that think it's a lot easier than what it was originally. Yeah. Once you unpack it, it is really, really simple. And I think for me, the issue is there's nothing in the Indigo Learning Resource Guide that I can refer you to, which makes it a lot harder. But once you unpack it, it is really straightforward. Yeah. Now, I just cut somebody off. Any questions before I move on to the last question of the assignment? Are we okay with this, team? Yeah? Okay. So everyone's taken notes of that? You happy for me to scroll down to the next screen? All right. Yeah. You're right, Andrea. Yeah. You can take a photo of it with your phone as well. Yeah, that's what Marion's doing. Yeah, all good. But yeah, this is all you. This is us collectively coming up with the response together. So well done. I think we've done really well in answering this. Oh, that's great. So Melody's written here. Definitely overcomplicated. Thank you for clearing it up. No, that's good. I won't be sharing the notes. So whatever you see here, please take a photo of it. The reality is I have filmed this session anyway, so you can look back on the session later on as well. Hopefully that will work.
So it won't be like plagiarism if we write it,
Well, you write it in your own words, okay? Obviously,
yeah,
I'm writing in shorthand, typing it as I speak, but you can write it in sentences, you know. And the reality is it's not plagiarism because we're not referencing it from a source. It's an idea that we've all come together with, okay? Don't reference Maria Francis. That would be really funny. Okay, let's move on, team. Moving on to the very last question around policy development, okay? Now, I think we've done well in unpacking policy frameworks up here because it will help us answer some of these questions below, okay? You know more than you think. Okay, first question here. Identify 4 things that we need to consider when we're developing and reviewing policies, okay? So let's say, for example, you've got the WHS policy, and now, Andrew's been tasked to update it. What do you think we need to consider? Joseph?
Yeah, so you need input from your workers. So
stakeholders, yes.
Yeah, in my organisation, a policy might be drafted and then it's sent to the workers for review, so that if we have any questions or concerns, we are raised before it gets implemented.
Amazing. You've identified a few things here that is really important. So I'm going to start with stakeholders, right? So before we review or develop any policy, we're not the subject matter experts, okay? We don't know everything. We need to engage employees. We need to engage managers, obviously senior staff. We need to engage any subject matter experts in the area, yeah? Any committees. There might be a WHS committee maybe. Senior staff, committees, but we also might want to consider engaging some clients and the community. It really does depend on what the policy is. Does that make sense? So you need to consider all stakeholders, okay? And a stakeholder is anybody that is impacted by the policy. Okay, implementation was something else that Joseph mentioned earlier. Now, before we consider implementation, we need to draft the policy, we need to get this endorsed, and then we need to consider how to implement this, okay? Because you might have 3,000 staff members that need to know about the new policy that you've just updated. So the implementation aspect is really important because, as I mentioned earlier, there is no point in having a policy that sits on a shelf that nobody knows about, okay? Because there's too many consequences for that, as we mentioned earlier, right? So implementation is really important. Now, Andrea, you've written up-to-date legislation. Amazing. So legislation needs to be up to date. So we need to review our existing policy and actually determine whether or not there's been any legislative changes in the interim period, okay? So it needs to be up to date. That is amazing. That's really, really important. But let's go one step back. Before we review any organisation policy, let's not create more work for us unnecessarily. Let's identify if there's a need. Yes, I'm going to put identification of need. Because if there's no need to update it, don't create more work for yourselves. So identification of need is the first step for existing policies. Okay, obviously when you're developing a new policy, you've already identified that there's a need to because you've been tasked with that job. So you need to consider, speak to stakeholders. You need to then obviously write up the policy, get it, you know, feedback and endorsement. So feedback from staff, then endorsement, and then consider how do I implement this to everybody that needs to know about it. Yeah, So you can put down any one of these four and that can be part of your answer. Does that make sense, people? We're happy with that? Any questions? No? Okay, the next question, team, is quite similar. Okay, it's quite similar to that question. So this is asking us to explain the process and factors that needs to be considered when we're updating a policy. And then they want us to make sure that we include an answer under each one of these categories. Okay, and then the totality of our answer needs to be about 100 to 150 words. So let's unpack this quickly together. Timeframes for review. How often do we need to review a policy?
Well, it could be situational. So if something happened, then
arises,
it might be a reaction and sort of go, all right, we might need to review that policy to check that everything was covered or something. Yeah,
a review may be required following an incident. Yeah, there might have been a workplace incident and you think, oh, is that in our policy? Let's double check and review it. Very good, Joseph. But typically, as Danielle and Andrea have mentioned in the chat box, it is every 1 to 3 years. Okay, every 1 to 3 years typically, or as required would be the answer. Okay, because if you've just recently updated it, but then long behold, a month later, the legislation changes, you're going to have to do it again. Does that make sense? But typically every 1 to 3 years, if there's been no changes in between. Okay, what about legal requirements? We mentioned it earlier, it has to be up to date, okay? Legislation needs to be up to date, short and sharp. No point having outdated legislation in the policy because you're going to be exposed to multiple breaches within the organisation, okay? What about stakeholder engagement? We mentioned earlier who our stakeholders are, okay? So I'm going to copy this down. These are our lovely stakeholders, okay? Our stakeholders are employees, managers, senior staff, committee members, clients, and the community. So anybody impacted is a stakeholder. Now, the other thing you need to consider also is that how do you engage your stakeholder group? You're going to do it via email? You're going to do it in a face-to-face? Yeah? Or you're going to do it in a meeting? It's up to you. So you need to consider how to engage, stakeholders, okay? That also includes consideration of how many stakeholders is enough. Because if you have 3,000 clients, you're going to be talking to 3,000 clients? You're not. Does that make sense? So you need to consider how many stakeholders you need to engage and how to engage them. Okay, so these are just things to consider when we're thinking about updating and reviewing policy. Does that make sense? I'm not going too fast. Yeah. Okay. Now these two, I'm going to remove that. That was from last week. So these two things are quite self-explanatory. Okay. Translation and reflection of policies in daily practice. I've mentioned this earlier. Okay. We need to have policy that is relevant to the people that need to use it. And it needs to be realistic enough to be translated into daily practice. Does that make sense? It needs to be realistic. It needs to be able to be applied to daily practice. There's no point having a policy that makes no sense to the people that need to do it or deliver it. So that's why the engagement piece with stakeholders is really important, because they will tell you, you know, what they need in terms of doing their job on a daily basis, or whether or not it's not realistic what you put down in the policy. Does that make sense?
Something else would be to include definitions if they're required. So if they're using specific, you know, legal words or something, they might need to have a definitions so that people understand what it means.
Amazing, thank you. Definitions, and we use a lot of acronyms within the organisation, but just making sure that we're quite clear on our definitions and on our acronyms as well. And language, it has to be simple and clear. Okay, simple and clear so everybody can understand it. It's no point writing an amazing policy with really, really, really long and big words that nobody understands. Okay, so it has to be simple and clear so that everybody that reads the policy understands what is expected of them. Yeah. Make sense? Okay. And the last one, this is quite simple, speaks for itself, okay? The policy needs to be fair and equitable. And it has to include and be available to all areas of diversity, okay? Fair and equitable. When I talk about diversity, what do I mean? Diversity mean to people?
Ability, age, race, genders, sexuality,
Yeah.
cultural background, religion.
Thank you. Everything. Yeah, excellent. Age, ability, sexuality, religion, you know, sex, culture, all of that. Yeah, it needs to be fair and equitable to everybody, whatever cohort you're in. Okay. All right. Inclusive to all. Excellent. Thank you. And race, religion, gender. Thank you so much. Yes, inclusive to all. 100%. That's the key. It can't just be that it's only available to certain select people. All right. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'll leave it there for a little bit while people take a photo or think over it. Equality. Excellent. Include all of this in your answer. Okay. It has to be, you know, equality, equal to all, fair and equitable. Okay. I'm going to move on to the very last question, team. Okay. So this very last question here is simply an email. You need to write an email. Now, what you need to do is have a read through the sample policy that we've given you. Okay. Obviously, the sample policy has, you know, issues within it, because what you need to do now, okay, I'm going to scroll down to the question. What you need to do now is draft an email to the manager of this service and include 3 issues. 3 issues within the policy above. Okay, and then what you need to do is provide 2 suggestions. Okay, now we've gone and given you 2 hints with regards to what 2 issues are already. The first hint is, has the policy been reviewed regularly against current and up-to-date legislation and standards? Okay, so the policy review date is September 2018. The version date, sorry. The review date was a year later in 2019, and we're in 2021. It hasn't been reviewed. Yeah? Issue number 1. Straightforward. Okay? The next one is also another hint for your team. Would someone reading the policy know which legislative and ethical responsibilities inform the policy? I want you to have a read of it. But the one thing that I can already see here is that. Is that up to date, team? What is it now called? We mentioned this earlier.
Work health and safety.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, so that's out of date. Okay, we've spoken about legislation being up to date, and that's already out of date. So that's already 2 issues within the policy. The third is around language. So I want you to read this a little bit later and consider whether or not you think the language is clear around what is expected of the employees. And also, language needs to be consistent. Okay, now I'm going to give you a hint here, because sometimes the employees are referred to as family and community workers. Okay, but sometimes they're also, called community workers, family and community workers, community workers. So it has to be consistent. If you want to call employees family and community workers, just make sure that it's consistent throughout the document as well. Okay. Family workers, community services workers, right? So we've got all this different language, and then they're called down here family community workers. So just make sure if you're referring to an employee as one name, make sure that it's consistent throughout. Okay, so we've identified already the 3 issues here. So what you're going to do is write, dear manager, thank you for asking me to review the sample policy. Okay, sample policy above. Make sure you write down the name of what it is. And then all you need to do is then put down here the 3 issues I've identified. 1, put them down. 1, 2, 3. Okay. And then you can then put in your email 2 suggestions I've identified are as follows. Tell me, what will be 2 suggestions to mitigate what we've identified earlier? How are we going to make sure we update the policy every year or by the review date? How are we going to do that? How are we going to make sure the policy is reviewed regularly? Anyone? Yeah, thank you.
Oh.
Yeah. So what was that?
Oh, I was just going to say, like review it consistently, keep it consistent.
Yeah. So we've got here assign someone to it. So an alert system, a calendar reminder, or assign someone to the task. Yeah. I'll just say assigned a few people, because if you assign a particular person, that person might go on mat leave or they might leave the organisation. So you might want to assign a group. Okay, so let's assign the HR team to make sure they review this. Right, so that's one solution to that issue. The other one around legislation not being current is as simple as making sure you review policy and legislation and ensure that it's up to date. Yeah. So you might want to, make sure that you and this is up to date. And it may be that you want to register to, a publication or a certain website so that they send you an email alert with regards to when, policies or legislation are updated, because then you can then go back to your organisation and make sure that you update that. Yeah. Then you go, regards, and your name. Guess what? That's it. How do people feel? A lot clearer? Clear as mud? Yeah. Not
So
as
much
hard.
easier to follow.
Oh, amazing. I'm so glad and so grateful. Well, thank you so much for joining. Okay. For those that haven't joined to do the first half, please come back next Thursday, 11 a.m. Otherwise, if this is the last bit of the assignment, please submit it. Rest assured that your teachers will always give you feedback. And if you miss one minor detail, you will always get an opportunity to resubmit. Okay. So have a go at it. Online learning is very hard to classroom setting, so please be kind to yourself. And if you get a resubmit, it's okay. It is our way of giving you feedback, so don't be discouraged. All right, team. Have a lovely day. Nice to see you all.
Mariah, can I ask a question?
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
And gonna